All right, so welcome back, everyone. We're so excited to have you with us again for this wonderful book study series, The Writing Rope with Joan Sedita, the author. We're so honored to have her here and to have you here. Thank you so much for being here after what I'm sure has been a very busy day, and here you are learning with us again. Thank you so very, very much. My name is Dr. Pam Kastner. I have the honor of serving as PaTTAN State Lead for Literacy, and joining from the PaTTAN Literacy team this evening is Dr. Stacy Cherney, our Central Region Lead, Literacy Lead. Show a wave to you. And Maggie Maggie, you have to do your last name again. Do that for me, Maggie. I'm terrible with that.
That's okay. It's Maggie Serpolowski. I'm excited to be here with you this evening.
Thank you, Maggie, and Nicole Kopko from the central office too. So thank you, Nicole, as well for being here. We're very excited to start chapters 3 and 4 with you this evening. Joan's having a little bit of a technical challenge that we've been working around, but she can you can hear her and we can communicate with her. We figured that out. So we are going to turn it over to her. I'm going to put it in the chat so she knows to start. And she'll get started. Thanks again for being here. Oh, one thing before we do start, I'm so sorry, Joan. Make sure that you have your actual name in your screen. If you want Act 48, we don't know who you are if it says like Mary's iPhone. So it's very important that you have your actual name in the screen. And all you have to do is go up to the corner, the right-hand corner, and the 3 little dots. If you click on that, you can rename yourself. We'll be putting the Padlet link in throughout the evening. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy Cherney, who's going to share Joan's bio, and then Joan will start.
Good evening. Sorry, Joan.
Give me a thumbs up when you guys are ready for me to join in. All right.
Okay, Joan, we're gonna introduce you officially and give your bio so everyone can hear all about you prior to you starting this evening. Joan Sedita is the founder of Keys to Literacy, a literacy professional development organization. Joan has been in the literacy field for over 40 years as a teacher, administrator, and teacher trainer. She has authored multiple literacy professional development programs, including the Key Comprehension Routine, the Key Vocabulary Routine, Keys to Beginning Reading, Keys to Content Writing, Keys to Early Writing, Understanding Dyslexia, and Adolescent Literacy Reading. Beginning in 1975, she worked for 23 years at the Landmark School, a pioneer in the development of literacy intervention programs. As a teacher, principal, and director of the Outreach Teacher Training Program at Landmark, Joan developed expertise, methods, and instructional programs that address the literacy needs of students in grades K through 12. Joan was one of the 3 lead trainers in Massachusetts for the Reading First program and was a letters author and trainer. Joan received her master's in reading from Harvard University and her bachelor's from Boston College. And now I present to you Joan Sedita.
All right. I think you're ready for me, right?
We are ready.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. And looks like we have very similar numbers to maybe a little less than last week. I don't know if all of you who are on tonight were here last week or not, but let me just a couple of introductory things. We are on the second of our 5 series, and thank you again. Big thanks to everyone at PaTTAN for giving me this opportunity to do this book study with you. We're basically doing 2 chapters at a time for each session. Last time we covered the introduction to the writing rope framework and chapter 2, which is about what do we know about effective writing instruction. And, you know, within those topics, just by way of a quick little summary, you know, we reviewed what were the major pieces to the writing rope. And tonight, we're going to drill down on 2 of them, the transcription strand and the writing craft strand. But on our first evening, I quickly went through the other pieces. I might probably, maybe on the next time I show the rope in the coming slide, I might just do a really quick 3-minute overview again. We also talked a lot about the important role that teachers of any subject can play especially in grades 5 and up, where oftentimes students have 2 or as many as 5 different teachers. And part of what we addressed was, and a lot of this is connected to the critical thinking strands of the writing rope, right, and the text structure, that a teacher of science or of history or even English, where you're focusing in on a certain kind of piece of literature, right, that in many respects, you're the better person to show students how to write about what they're learning, to write about their subject, right? Because it's sometimes, especially by the time you get up into the, upper middle grades and beyond, it's often referred to as disciplinary reading or disciplinary writing. So that was an important point that we made last time. I also, while we did that, identified 3 major types of writing that can happen to support content learning. We talked a little bit about quick writes, and then sort of medium kinds of writes, content writing tasks, things like summarizing, which we'll get into in one of our later meetings. And then also the more detailed kinds of more longer kinds of research kinds of writing tasks. We in chapter 2, when we were going over the research about this, I called your attention to several major reports that reported on major meta-analyses of the research related to writing. You can go back in, and a lot of that is summarized in the 2nd chapter. We also reviewed some major teaching principles, including the IWU gradual release. We talked a lot about mentor models, which I'm going to address again tonight, especially when we talk about writing craft. So that's just a quick little review of what we did on the last meeting, and a couple of other introductory things. I showed this slide, or a version of it, the first night, and I just wanted to call everyone's attention to, if you do have the book, several pages in the very beginning, and I'll just hold this up to my camera, you'll see that the book has a spot with a code, and I've put the code on the slide here, that allows you to go to the Brooks Publishing website that has, they call it the download hub. It's not just my book. They have stuff from other of their publications. Like I know, for example, Nancy Hennessy's book about comprehension, they have some great stuff from her book. But all of the, or most of the templates and graphic organizers and things that are in the Writing Rope book, they have put together in an electronic format so you can download them and use them with your students. One thing I do want to point out is the code, as you see it, that second letter, so it's a small x, and that second letter is an L, a lowercase L, not a capital I. I know some folks had some difficulty dropping that in. The other thing that I have on here is a code that Brooks has given to folks who are participating in this book study. It is only good until the end of December. If you decide to purchase the book from Brooks, you go to their website, it will give you 10% off plus free shipping. I know last week we had a few folks in the chat saying they were having a hard time using the code. They did check it. It is viable. One thing they suggested is that when you go to check out, there is a drop-down menu where you would put about codes. So make sure that you're looking for that. All right. So we're basically going to cover chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is about transcription skills. And I'm showing once again the beautiful colored version of the Writing Rope that the graphic designers at Brooks put together for this book. And so while we have the whole thing up in front of us, I just want to really quickly say a few words about the big picture for the Writing Rope for those of you who might have missed it. And I think it's such an important big picture couple of points that I want to make, that even if you heard me say this last week, I think it's worth repeating. So this is meant as a framework, right, for educators, teachers, literacy people, even administrators, to think about, if we're teaching writing, writing has multiple components to it, just like reading does. But unfortunately, many teachers don't know what those components might be. And so that's why I put this together. That was my main reason, to be able to enable an educator to say, all right, look, I can tell you what the major components of reading are, and I can now tell you what the major components of writing are. And that enables you to, when you're thinking about your daily lesson plans, your long-term lesson plans, if you're developing a curriculum around writing instruction, if you're thinking about purchasing a writing program, it gives you a framework to be able to say, are all the pieces there? Are we covering all the major areas or components that will help grow our students' writing? I won't get into a lot of the detail about each piece of the rope, but on this slide, you can see down the left column where I put a lot of subcomponents or subcategories of skills and strategies and techniques that our students need to learn. So the first, I also just want to remind us that the top one, the critical thinking, that has to do with all the skills and strategies associated with writing about what we're learning and writing to text, note-taking, summarizing, all those things. That falls under there, as well as the stages in the writing process. That one, along with text structure, which happens at lots of different levels, right? These are the two that I truly believe every content teacher can and must play a role in helping for instruction. The English teachers can't do it alone. And as I said before, you can show kids how to apply this to your particular subject area, especially the text structure, because you're using text in your subject areas. Maybe it's a chapter in your textbook or an article or something on the web. If you take a moment, and this gets us a little bit into writing craft, right? If you take a moment to use the text that students are reading as a sample of how text can be structured, right? Then you can flip it so that if you just talked about, this is an excellent example of a descriptive writing piece or a narrative piece, or this is a great way that this text that we're reading writes an introduction for you. Now we can flip it so that the students begin to emulate that in their own writing. So I really think the critical thinking and the text structure strand are the two in particular that all content teachers can play a role in. And I also still feel that the syntax strand as well. We're going to be getting into that. I think it's sometime in the next one or two sessions. And I think content teachers can play a role with that. So the two that we're focusing on tonight, I think for the most part, tend to be the purview of your English language arts or your English or your writing teachers, more so than the other three strands. So let's delve a little bit more into transcription, which is at the bottom. I think I mentioned this to you last week. We know that explicit instruction in both transcription skills, which you see listed on the left side, and the higher level, more critical thinking, composing skills, students need explicit instruction in both of these, right? Now, transcription, think about the word that's embedded in that, right? Transcribe. So transcription skills are things like spelling, so that you can make sure you're representing the words you want people to read in a way that they can read them. So you're transcribing the spoken word using the graphemes that represent the sounds in the word. But it's also either handwriting and or keyboarding. So how do you get what you want to say out on the paper? You can be, if you're using word processing, you need to have pretty fluent keyboarding skills. If you're handwriting, if it's going to be on paper, you need to have either print or cursive, but you need to be somewhat fluent in that. The research tells us, Graham points this out in several of his research articles that are referred to in the book, that, for students who leave the end of third or throughout fourth grade, if they leave those grades and they're not fluent with their spelling and their handwriting or keyboarding, what happens is they have to put considerable effort, right, into transcribing the words on the page And that takes away from the higher level composing and critical thinking skills that they need. On the right side, you've got the composing skills. This is everything from the other strands in the rope: generating your ideas, organizing them, using the stages of the writing practice, the language you have to express your ideas, awareness of TAP, which is task, audience, and purpose, which we're going to get into a little more tonight. And then, of course, that integration of comprehension and writing skills at the same time. One of the things, and just as a reminder for those of you who might not have tuned in last time, the page numbers on the bottom of the slides refer to the page numbers in the Writing Rope book. So if you want to, if you have your books, and turn to those pages while we're talking about them, or just refer to them later. So what I did is grab some quotes that I have here from, this is coming from pages 24 to 25 about spelling. So you can read along with me. Research findings emphasize the importance of spelling for overall writing quality for students in the early grades. Motes pointed out that students with spelling difficulty may restrict what they write to words they can spell, with, as Louisa says, inevitable loss of verbal power, or they may lose track of their thoughts when they get stuck trying to spell a word. Research has also found that explicit spell instruction is more effective than informal instruction. And that's why I suggested last time, and I will emphasize it again, that I believe the best place to be teaching spelling is during a phonics lesson, where we combine the decoding with the encoding. They're like the yin and yang, right? As students are learning the way that we represent spoken sounds in a word, that helps teach them the options they have for graphemes when actually spelling words. Phonics instruction provided in the primary grades helps children use the alphabetic principle to learn how the 26 letters in the English alphabet are used to represent the 44 sounds in the English language. And then, of course, advanced word study instruction is going to also address how we read and spell multi-syllable words. So, as we're teaching students the concept of schwa that happens in unaccented syllables in multi-syllable words, that's important so that when they're trying to write these longer words, they recognize that sound they say here that's kind of muffled, well, it could be represented by lots of different vowels. It's also really important for students to have been taught spelling principles, especially for adding endings to words. And one last thing that I really want to emphasize here is that, and I bet those of you who work with older struggling writers who also are struggling readers, you see this all the time. They often, especially as they get older, are really hesitant to use some longer words in their writing, even though the words are beautiful words and they capture what they want to say, and it would engage the reader more. They will skip those words and instead put in a single syllable word or two syllable word because they know that they can spell it. So that embarrassment that comes along when we're writing and people are seeing our writing is all tied in with this. In this chapter, what I do is, look, it wasn't designed as a book to teach people how to teach spelling, right? Nor is it meant to focus on in depth on phonics. But one of the things that I did do is include a phonics scope and sequence that can be used for both decoding and encoding. So those of you who have the book, if you can turn to pages 26 to 28, that's where you'll see this scope and sequence. For those of you who maybe have not purchased the book, that's fine. But I also just wanted to point out that this scope and sequence, it's a generic one that I put together several years ago, and it is, you can download it for free from one of my blog posts from a year or two ago. So at the ending slide, I think I have a link to my blog post. They're something I write once a month. I take a topic, I go into it in depth. And so you can go to the site where all my monthly blogs are, and there's one about a phonics scope and sequence, and you can download this there. we know that there are lots of challenges with spelling English, right? It's much easier to decode words than to encode them. And as I mentioned, especially crazy things like the schwa sound, right? But really a phonics instruction, it really needs to be also about the English orthography. So, I have a quick question to pose out for you to reflect on. And I know with a large group like this, sometimes people don't feel comfortable, typing in a chat, but I would just love to hear what you say about this question I'm posing here. Are a phonics scope and sequence and spelling rules used to teach phonics for decoding and spelling in your school or district? It'd be great. Drop it in a chat, yes, no, partially. Is it something you wish you'd see more? I think it would be helpful for us to all kind of get a sense of, for those of you listening in, is there a phonics scope and sequence, either a generic one, like the one that's in the writing rope book here, or perhaps one that comes with a phonics program or a core reading program that you're using. And basically, if we think about what should be covered, if we're going to teach spelling, that's why I put this scope and sequence in here, really, to say, let's not forget any of these orthographic and phoneme grapheme connections as kids move beyond 3rd and 4th grade. So the other thing that I do in this chapter is talk a little bit about handwriting. If you, again, turn to pages 29, it begins there and on through 32. I address some of the issues that often come up. You see them listed here, right? So why do students need handwriting instruction? What do we know from the research? What benefits are there for that? And there are quite a few, right? I also address the issue of print versus cursive and point out that even the leading researchers in our field have not come to a consensus about, is it better to just teach print and then in around 3rd grade, when we typically used to start teaching cursive, should we not do that and instead do keyboarding? Should we get kids into cursive writing faster than print? It's also called manuscript. I haven't decided on, I don't have the definitive answers and neither does the research. But what I do want you to know is we do know that it is worth teaching kids handwriting. And again, this can begin as early as kindergarten and 1st grade. As we start teaching students the letters and letter sound correspondences, that is the perfect time to have them practicing being able to write those upper and lowercase letters. So the other thing that I do in this chapter, this begins around page 31, is, all right, what kinds of things should we be teaching around handwriting in the early years? So it includes things like really basic, but pencil grasp, right? Letter formation, including teaching strokes, and then several things that are associated with legibility. And it's really, I think, an important part of print concepts when we think about writing, not reading, but writing. And that is having even our youngest kids recognize that you have a lot to say. And first, you're going to say it through the drawings that you make before you're able to write words. But once you can start writing words and then phrases and then sentences, we have to be aware of who's reading our writing, not only from what we want them to understand from our ideas, right? But we also want to make it as easy for that person to be able to read our writing. So making sure we have enough space between our words, right? Making sure that our letters stay sort of consistent. And so that's what the importance of legibility is. All right, so for those of you that are just joining us tonight, this is a reminder that that little icon you see with the double C, that's a visual, a graphic that the Brooks folks put into various places in the book where I wanted people to stop and reflect on what they were reading and learning in the book, and then make a connection to their actual teaching, right? Because that should be the ultimate goal of a book like this, is how do we move the needle to enable teachers to not only be aware of the research, but understand how do you make that connection to what you're teaching. So in these book studies, what I've decided to do is in a couple of places, bring in the questions or tasks that are in the Connect to the Classroom. So these are the ones that I put in for this chapter. First was identify students who have difficulty with writing. Do you think part of what contributes to their writing difficulty is a lack of fluent spelling or handwriting keyboarding? Okay, just one second. If someone from PaTTAN could give me a call, because you look like you're frozen and I'm not sure if anybody is hearing me. Can somebody get in touch with me?
We can hear you.
Can hear you.
You can hear me? Give me a nod. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. So, do you think part of what's contributing to the students who have difficulty, how much of it is this lack of fluent spelling or handwriting and keyboarding? The last question, looks like there's a spelling error there. We can take the E off the how. How are spelling and handwriting and keyboarding taught in your school? So again, if anybody feels comfortable in the chat, typing in their responses here, would love to hear it. And the takeaway from this is that while the foundations for most of this should be taught prior to 4th grade, if students don't have these at a fluent level, we want to make sure that that we provide some supplemental instruction and intervention so that these students have the fluent ability to spell and handwrite. All right, so now let's look at chapter 4. This focused on the green level here. By the way, people have asked me, did I pick the colors for some reason? And the answer is no. The graphic designers at Brooks picked the colors. My original was in black and white. So let's look at the green strand, writing craft, right? So what is it that falls under writing craft? So it's certainly things like word choice, right? And awareness of task, audience, and purpose, but then a whole host of what are called literary devices. And we'll get into all those in just a minute. So let's focus a little bit more on task, audience, and purpose, sometimes referred to as TAP. These three things combined are really important because if you're aware of them as a writer, it should be influencing a lot of decisions that you have to make during the writing process. It's going to influence decisions about the words that you use, about the text structure you choose, whether you decide to bring in certain literary devices, which we'll get to in a minute, right? It also affects the tone of what you have to say. So it really should drive a lot of decision making, but many of our students, especially the ones who struggle, unfortunately, these kids don't think about this. They're just focused on getting stuff down on the paper. Most of the time, they think the only person who's ever going to read it is their teacher. And we want to get away from that, right? And one of the things that we talked about in the last session that's in the beginning of the book is one of these teaching principles is that when possible, if we can assign writing tasks that have authentic audiences, that's going to be much more helpful. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a few slides. So task, audience, purpose. Now, in the book, we have, I don't have the page number on there, so let me just look it up for you. But we have one of the handouts, and again, this is available at the Brooks for download as well. But it's a series of questions that you can use to either ask your kids or keep them in front of them, right? So that they can ask themselves questions that are going to get them to think about task, audience, and purpose. So this is the smaller version of this is on page 35, and there's a full page example of it in the appendix of the book, or you could download this. Now, if you are feeling that 3 questions for each of these is too overwhelming for some of your students at first, then just pick one. Just pick one question from each category, and then gradually, as your students become more aware of TAP, then you can put all 3 questions in front of them. But as you can see, it's really getting to think about under task, what is my assignment? What am I supposed to do? A lot of times kids lose track of that. Where this becomes also really important is on high stakes state assessments, where students are often asked to do a task such as the following. They're given sometimes, maybe 1 to 3 different sources. One of them might even be a video, right? The others are text, and they're asked a very specific prompt. And what they're supposed to do is go to the sources, find only the relevant information or evidence that answers that prompt, pull it out, and then write about it in their response. Now, we're going to get into that a lot more in our last meeting when we talk about writing from sources. But think about how many of your students, they start looking at the sources and they completely lose track of the task. And so what happens? They go back and they just start writing about what they remember, and they're not truly answering the question or the prompt. So it really becomes important in a high stakes writing situation. What is it that I'm being asked to do? Am I asked to summarize? Am I asked to retell everything I remember? Am I asked to write a description, or am I supposed to compare and contrast? And then finally, what form should my writing take? Under audience, who is the audience? And it could be a real authentic audience or not, meaning sometimes we can assign students a task to write for a certain person or group of people in mind that we know might never even read our response, right? So I'll give you an example from a content classroom. A teacher was going to have students write an informational piece about Napoleon Bonaparte. But after doing our training, the teacher said, I changed it up. And I said, I asked them to write a letter from Napoleon Bonaparte to the subjects that he ruled over, right? To make the case for why he was a good ruler and why they should support him. Now, that's an example of the student is thinking about this really authentic audience, right? The people who lived in France. They're dead, they're not alive, so they're never going to actually read the piece. But it's that act of feeling like you're writing for something, for a real person. I can't remember the exact quote now, but John Steinbeck once wrote something about this issue of audience, and if I can paraphrase it, he said, I like to think about even just one real person that I'm writing to, and I might not know that person, but the fact that I'm thinking about them when I'm writing affects my writing. And that's what this piece here is all about. And so the more authentic we can make the audiences, better. And then the student is answering that question. Well, who will actually read my writing piece? One of the things that I share with you later in the book is something called a WAG, or a writing assignment guide. It's a tool that teachers use to plan a writing task. And it has sections in it to sort of remind the teacher of lots of things to be aware of. One of the sections in the WAG is, what is the audience? So the teacher is actually saying to the students who might read their piece. The other thing that's tied to this is, if we bring in another one of the teaching principles that we talked about last time, which is providing opportunities for students to work collaboratively with their peers. This is where, if you have a writing assignment and you use the WAG and you say, part of what I'm going to do in supporting you in scaffolding this is I'm going to give you opportunities at the thinking stage to brainstorm with a peer or peers about what you want to say. I'm going to give you maybe a collaborative opportunity to have someone review your first draft. Well, now when you're writing about who the audience is, it's not just the direct audience for the writing piece, but you're reminding students that some of their class peers are going to be reading this. And then finally, purpose. What is the purpose? Is it to, and this, by the way, gets tied into something else we talked about last week, right? The 3 main types of writing, your opinion or argument, informational or narrative. So that's, in many respects, the very first question that students need to ask them. Once they know what the task is and who the audience is, they have to say, so what is my purpose? Is my purpose to tell a story, recount something? If that's the case, I'm going to use narrative. Is my purpose to make a point or to convince somebody of something? Well, then I'm going to use opinion or argument. And is my purpose to inform? Then I need to use information. So that's TAP. And I guess a question to ask all of you is, do you think these questions could be helpful to pose to your students? If so, please download the template, use it with them, modify it, make a poster out of it, whatever aspect of it you think would be helpful. So on this slide, I've grabbed a couple of other quotes from this chapter in the book on page 34. Writing for different purposes often means writing for different audiences. To help understand the role of audience in writing, it's important to design writing activities that naturally lend themselves to different audiences. Otherwise, students may view writing in school as only writing for their teacher. And so have students do things like pretend they're writing a blog post for a famous blogger, right? Pretend that they are writing something to a teen magazine that they follow, right? Or that they're writing a letter to anybody in their community. It could be family members, it could be politicians, it could be people in school. The thing that so many teachers do, right? Like the 5th grade students write a letter to the 4th grade students that are going to be coming up into the classroom next year. Students should learn to adjust their tone and word choice to better convey their meaning and suit their audience. To develop this skill, students might write about the same topic for different audiences. So that's an interesting kind of task, right? Especially if it's a shorter, maybe it's a quick write task. So you might say to students, all right, the first time I want you to write this, it's going to be with the school principal in mind. The second time that you're going to write this, I want you to write it thinking about a peer student in mind. So having them write the same thing, but for 2 different audiences really highlights for them the decisions that they get to make, right? About how they're going to say this and what they're going to write. We also know that the research shows over and over again that students will be more motivated and engaged if they are able to keep in mind an authentic audience. So this is something, I don't have this listed in the writing book. This list comes from another book that I wrote prior that I drew a lot of concepts from, and that's my book called Keys to Content Writing. It's tied to some professional development that we do. So here's examples, again, of possible authentic audiences: members of the community, organizations, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, members of your soccer team, right? Businesses and corporations. And I'm going to show you some great examples of how kids got feedback by writing to big businesses that they never thought they would hear from. Politicians, younger, older students. I mentioned family members, peers. So just to give you some ideas about what we mean for authentic audiences. So with this slide and the next couple, I'm going to show you some examples of just how when kids get to write to real audiences, how powerful it can be, right? How it gets them to understand how transformative writing can be. So this is a little visual here. I don't know, maybe some of you have actually heard of this young woman. Her name is Martha Payne. And she, several years back, she's from Britain, and she started writing a blog where she described the lunches, the horrible lunches that she had at her school. And at first, just a few other people in the school started following it. And I've given you actually one of her blog posts. You can see the pizza in the first picture was all right, but I've enjoyed one more croquette. That's certainly an English person speaking there, right? So she started writing this blog. Well, the interesting thing, she called it Never Seconds. And what happened was, after a while, the folks that ran the school didn't like that she was writing so negatively. And so they tried to shut her blog down. And, oh no, it was Scotland. There we go, sorry. And they tried to shut her blog down. And what happened was it kind of caught the interest of a lot of very famous bloggers, and they picked up her cause. And before you know it, she became a quote kind of a world phenom. So I don't know if you're familiar with Chef Jamie Oliver, but he had a massive following for his Twitter, and he took up her cause. You can see one of his tweets: "Stay strong, Martha." Retweet this to show your support. So I just want you to think about how you could share this to students about the power that this girl felt in being able to write just some simple things about her school lunches. This is another example from our content writing training. This is a letter on the left, you can see. It's from a student who wrote Steph Curry. If you follow basketball, you know Steph Curry is a very well-known basketball star. And as you can see, Riley wrote to Steph complaining that his new line of clothing, sports car clothing, did not include stuff for girls. And she was pretty upset about that. And so she wrote Steph, probably not thinking in a million years she'd get a response, but I want you to look on the right and see the response that she actually got. And this is one that actually just came up in the news not too long ago. So this was a 4-year-old who obviously loves Entenmann's Little Bites, but he was upset and felt that they should add one more to the pack. There just weren't enough in there. And so I want you to see, now he was too young to write this himself, so he dictated. His mom said, "We're going to write a letter to the Entenmann's company." And she wrote it for him. You can see his signature. At that point, it's just an X. Now, here's the amazing thing is I want you to look at the letter that he got back. "We were so delighted to hear how much Xander loves Little Bites, etc., etc." And the really cool thing is they then sent him a box of Little Bites. They did not actually change the number in there, but so my point with all this is I want you to be thinking especially about the authentic audience part of TAP, right? Like the more we can make writing real for kids and connected to their daily lives, and the more opportunities we can give them to feel like, oh my gosh, I can actually make a difference with my writing, the better. So the connect to the classroom questions for this are: do you explicitly teach students about TAP? And how often do you assign writing tasks that have authentic audiences? A little bit more about writer's craft. We talked about this last time, and I actually showed you some examples. Maybe if I have a minute or two of time, I might go back to some of those slides, but it's often referred to as writer's moves and the art of writing, right? So it's anything that a writer does on purpose to make writing look or sound a certain way, right? And the writer is going to be making these decisions, which are affected by TAP, about the tone and the voice you want to use in your writing, the word choice that you make, how you're going to change it to meet the needs of an authentic audience, and even how you're going to organize your piece, right? So elements of writing craft include the following. And in the book, I get in a little bit more detail about this, what each of these are, especially narrative point of view, what is first person, second, third person, right? But it includes first and foremost what's often referred to as writer's voice, right? That's the writer's unique style. And let's highlight this word: emotion and personality that the writer wants to get across in their writing, to either represent themselves, or let's say they're writing about characters in a narrative, to represent how the characters are feeling, right? It's sometimes referred to as writing from the heart, or doing something with your writing to make the reader feel some emotion. Think about how movies do that. If you cry at the movies, right? Well, we could do that through our writing as well. And how is writer's voice captured? It's achieved through the choice of language that we use to describe the action or the setting or the use of dialogue, especially in narrative. Word choice, we've said this before, but it's purposeful decisions we make about what vocabulary am I going to make and where am I going to place those words? Can I use descriptive and colorful language and very precise words? And think about how if I have a spelling problem, how that might impair my willingness to use some of these really important words. And then the literary devices, which in the book, I take each one of these and give you, a lot more detail about what they are. There are many, many more literacy devices than what I've got here. Certainly when you get up into the high school levels, I mean, there are hundreds of them. But what I tried to do in the writing rope book is identify for you the most common. And so again, in the book, this is in figure 4.5, which is on page 40. I give you some, information about what each of these are. And now, you're not going to expect a fourth grader to do a flashback or to do foreshadowing, right? But they might use hyperbole, and they're definitely going to use imagery and maybe sensory details, and certainly dialogue. And figurative language can be used across any grades. So I mentioned earlier that last time we delved a little bit more into mentor text. One of the things that I've given in the book is a tool, this chart that you can see here, for when we take an element in mentor text, we want to give kids a couple of examples, first of all. And so the way this chart is set up, there's space for you down the first left column to list what the 3 examples of the mentor text are going to be. Then we've got space to capture what did we notice about this piece, and then to finally answer that question, why did the author use it? Why did they use that technique or that choice of words or that particular literary element? So bear with me. What I'm going to do is go back to some examples that I gave you I don't mean to make you seasick here. All right, here we go. So some examples that I shared with you last week of mentor text. This was the example I shared that could be used with children as young as first grade, second grade. So you see 3 examples of mentor text, and all 3 of them are examples of a particular technique, writer's technique. Can you guess or tell me what's the technique that you see? What is happening in all 3 of these? What's being done? And the answer is they are using speech bubbles. That's the first, the big one. But the second is, in a couple of them, I want you to look at how they took certain words and did something visually with them. So up in the top right, the word cat and wet, you see how they made it bigger and blue and red, or look in the bottom left where they added to the word so much stuff to learn. So that's kind of a secondary thing that's going on here, but the big one is the speech bubbles. So if we were to think about that chart that I just shared with you, the teacher would, in preparation, list these 3 sources, right? Then together with the students, they would discuss and talk about what was similar in them, what was the technique, and then maybe ask and answer the question, why did they do it? But then the next most important thing is you then want the students to try it themselves. So you would say to them, all right, let's take one of your pictures that you drew, and you're telling a story about these 2 characters that you've drawn in your drawing. What do you want them to say to each other? And how can we do this technique that these published authors did? Now, the second example I gave you last time was a nonfiction lead. And let me just jump to it. So I gave you 2 mentor text examples. They're both examples of an introduction to an informational piece. They both are writing about the same subject, and that's high school dropout. But look at the difference between sample 1 and sample 2. And let me just go back. So what we're focusing on here in the mentor text is nonfiction leads or hooks. There are many, but I've only focused on 3 in the slide. So one trick or hook you can use is to use a quote. And these are all designed to get the leader, hook the reader in. You could use a quote. You could pose a question to the reader. You could also present fascinating facts. And so I would share with students 2, maybe even a third. And we did this last week. Which is the technique being used in example 1? And the answer is they used a quote. And what was the technique in example 2? They used presenting fascinating facts or details. And so once we're done with the mentor examples and we analyze them and we use think aloud with the students, we then say, and why did they do that? What was the value of that? Next step is now you emulate it. So I want you to take an introduction that you wrote to your most recent informational piece, and I want you to use either a quote, pose a question, or present some fascinating facts. So again, last time we went through that example as I was introducing the concept of mentor text to you, but I think it was helpful, especially for those of you who were not here last time to see that. All right, so with that, I have about 8 minutes left. So I'm going to put up this slide to give you the link to the Literacy Lines blog that I mentioned. Also, in addition to everything that's in this book that Brooks has published, I have a very large collection of free resources for folks at my Keys to Literacy website, and they include printables, but also links to videos and free archived webinars and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'm going to ask the PaTTAN folks if you, I think the thing we were going to do is give me a phone call. So if somebody wants to do that, you can start letting me know about what questions you want to pose. And there it is. It's coming in. Thank you. Hopefully we won't have too much reverberation. All right. What's the first question?
Okay, Joan. The first one is do we have reverb, just to clarify? Are we good?
Yeah. That's okay. As long as I can hear it, I'll repeat it. Go ahead.
What suggestions do you have to help students with spelling words with the schwa sound? In the past, I have had them write the word, determine which syllable was unaccented, and then allow them to ask Siri or look up how to spell the word. Is this okay?
Okay, that's a great question. So I think, look, when in doubt, you know what, hold on, let me, I'm just going to lower the volume here so you don't hear the reverb. Okay, when in doubt, and there's no other way, then sure, look it up, right? Why not? But part of teaching advanced word study is teaching kids about multisyllable words and how we flex where we put our stress in words. And so if we're doing advanced word study, which also includes morphology work, right? Roots, suffixes, prefixes. And there's lots of reasons to be focusing on this, not just for spelling, but also because it supports vocabulary, right? And figuring out the meaning of an unknown word. If we can have students focus on what they think the root word is, right? So let's see if I can think of an example. I'm not going to be able to come up with one right away, but whatever that root word is, very often, if it's a 1 or 2 syllable word, you're going to hear the vowel pronounced more wholly. It won't be schwa. So you'll hear that long A sound or that long I sound, right? And then, or the short sound of the vowel. And then once it gets put into the longer word that has prefixes and suffixes, it might change its sound to become schwa, but the students are thinking about the original vowel. So schwa is tough. There's no way around it, right? But I think trying to have kids think about what is the original root word may enable them to remember the sound. The other thing that some people tell me work for them is they'll have kids repeat the word, say the word, but instead of doing the schwa sound where it normally is, they will, in a sense, it's sort of like mispronouncing it, but like say the word, but then pronounce the vowel in its true longer short form. Now, the word might not be recognizable that way, but it's allowing them to hear that sound and associate it with the letter that they're seeing, and that may help some students remember it more. All right, let's see. let me raise this. Another question?
Yes. According to your research and expertise, what grade level should spelling stop?
Oh, I think never, but let me lower this. Well, first, let me say this. I am not a researcher, so I do not conduct research. So what I do is I look to the people that do that for a living. And that's why I felt it was important at the beginning of the book to summarize for you and give you links to some of the best researchers who are out there. But I think, well, let me say this. I won't tell you how old I am, but you can sort of guess if you know when I started my career, right? I am still learning to spell words. So I think there's always room to learn. Now, what I think might be underlying the question is you're asking, well, what if it's a 16-year-old who really can't spell? I mean, like, how much time are we going to put into that? And I think that there are some wonderful adaptive technology tools that are out there to help people who do have difficulty with spelling, or who might, as it relates to writing, might have difficulty with fine motor, right? And so we don't want to prohibit them from expressing themselves in writing, from composing the important messages that they have to share with others. And so if we can get around that transcription roadblock by using things like text to speech, why not do it? But I also get upset sometimes when I see students who are in 5th grade, you know, even 6th grade, and their spelling is poor and everybody just gives up completely on it. You know, maybe it's because for the first part of my career, I worked at a school for students with dyslexia and watched so often these students with just a little bit of, it would have to be tier 2 and 3 intervention, right? But a little bit of spelling instruction, jump that up by a couple of years. And so I don't think we should give up too early on these kids. It's interesting that both the questions right now have been related to the transcription strand. Does anybody have a question related to the writing craft strand that you can see? You there?
Yes.
Okay. So what do you think? You have a question for me related to writing craft?
Yeah, for handwriting, I find stamina is an issue, which I propose is due to a lack of sustained practice. Also, there's an inconsistency in instruction regarding path and movement and fluency with the skill of forming letters, whether manuscript or cursive.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, we have another question here that's related to handwriting, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, but you know, the purpose of the writing rope, it's not focused on handwriting and keyboarding and spelling, right? It's that I really do think takes place more in a phonics lesson. And again, also the focus of the book is on grades 4 and up, because I think the issue of transcription and how you teach it to a kindergartner or first grader is different than how you might address it with older students. Which, as I was just saying before, the older the students get, if the transcription is problematic due to some sort of a learning disability, right? Or dyslexia, you know, a language-based LD, or maybe dysgraphia, that we want to, at that point, not give up on trying to fill in those holes, but let's make sure that we're using adaptive technology so that they can get around that issue.
Thank you. Just, I know we're sort of running out of time here, but just one last thing. Does Joan have any resources to support teachers in providing feedback to students?
Yeah, so you know, in chapter I forget the number now, but it's the chapter where I talk about the 3 types of writing and text structure around that. One of the things I actually have in the book is examples of generic feedback checklists for both informational and argument. I also have in there an example of a peer-to-peer feedback checklist. I really believe that when it comes to giving students feedback on their writing, that checklists are much better than rubrics. Rubrics are more for adults who need to score students' writing. That's really different than if you're trying to give students feedback. So if you look at some of the checklists in the book, you'll see it breaks down things like transition. Did the student use transitions or not? How did the student do writing their introduction? If it was an opinion piece, did they state their position in the introduction? These are the kinds of things that give kids specific feedback so that the next time they go to write something, they can pick one or two of those things and focus on those correction areas instead of, redlining everything that's, quote, wrong with the writing, and then the students get overwhelmed. So I guess in this short amount of time, I guess my answer to that question about feedback is I believe feedback checklists are much better than traditional rubrics. And it looks like we're out of time. So
I'm gonna pass it to Stacy.
Yes. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this evening's book study session. We are grateful to Joan for deepening our knowledge of transcription skills and writing craft. The recording for this presentation will be added to the Padlet aligned to this book study series, as well as on the PaTTAN YouTube channel and the PaTTAN Literacy Resource Hub.